subjunctively robust implication relations is an essential element of the descriptive contentfulness of some bit of language. And because what that means is that there aren't any empirically meaningful expressions that don't have subjunctive necessary conditions. So, if I call something a lion, that can't be true unless things like if it were hungry, it would eat, if it were struck by lightning, it would die. A bunch of things like that have to be true if it's true that it's a lion. Those are consequences about what would happen to it. And if none of those are true, then it's not a lion. It's a lion facade or something like that. And one context in which this matters that sort of can stand for anyway as a cardinal instance of how this can be a radical thought is if you had been a fly on a wall when Quine's student David Lewis was arguing with him about whether modal concepts were okay, Lewis would have said, look, you accept non-modal empirical descriptive concepts like being copper and melting and so on. But what you object to is modal ones. Now, in my idiom, that's to say, you're only comfortable with concepts such that whether, or properties, such that whether something has that property or not depends just on the world that it's in. A modal property is one where whether something has it or not depends on what happens in other possible worlds. But look, what the possible world semantics lets us do is describe each world in extensional terms, in purely modally insulated terms, where I talk about it being it's being copper and it's being a sphere. And you don't need to look at any other possible world to know whether this thing's copper or a sphere. Well, I'm going to describe each possible world in terms of which non-modal properties are true in it. And then I'm going to introduce intentional with an S modal properties, a new class, a further class, where whether something has the property in this world can depend not just on what the non-modal facts in this world are, but also what the non-modal facts in other worlds are. So, for instance, if the same thing is a fact in all the other worlds, then I'll say it's necessarily copper. But otherwise, I'll just say it's copper. So this apparatus of possible worlds lets us take descriptive properties that are modally insulated, that only depend on this world, that are non-modal properties, and on the basis of that, explain how to introduce these funny to you, puzzling, intentional or modal properties. There, Quine, aren't you satisfied? That was how that apparatus was supposed to work. And Quine says, well, this concept of possible world of which you speak, I do not understand this. This didn't work for him. But what I want to point out is, if Sellars is right, that's completely incoherent. The thing isn't copper that in this world, if it has, if every descriptive property has got subjunctive necessary conditions, consequences, such that if they don't hold, it doesn't have this property, which are not, which have to do with how it would behave if. And we say, well, it's not copper unless if we were to apply an electric current to it, it would conduct it. And if we were to heat it to 1084 degrees C, it would melt. Well, that's to say that being a copper sphere or a wooden cube or whatever you might have thought the non-modal properties were that you used to specify each possible world, all of those are fully modalized properties that nothing can have if the surrounding possible worlds aren't right. That is, that have as necessary conditions the holding of modal properties of them. So, being fragile and so on, these dispositional properties are all part and parcel of any empirical descriptive properties. So, I'm not claiming that the entire framework of possible worlds is broken back. There's a challenge. Well, can you describe sort of the advance and the relations between what happens in one possible world and what happens in other possible worlds in a way that takes account of the fact that all the properties are modal properties, if by that you mean properties that have necessary conditions that depend on what would happen if, that is, on what's true in other possible worlds. And typically people are not careful in this way. They tell the sort of story I put in Lewis's mouth. And Sellars is saying that's deeply confused. It's deeply confused because it's not confused on the face of it. You have to think about what you're saying when you say, well, there's a lion in this world. Well, yes, but it's not a lion if, were we to take it apart, we find all this clockwork in it, then it wouldn't be a lion, and so on. So this actually goes very deep in the way you think about, for instance, what properties are and how the semantics works. The other note I wanted to hit, though I'm not going to be able to say very much about it, is Sellars says in one of the passages here, I guess that's passage 10 on page 2, he's done this dialogue between the rationalist and the empiricist, and finally says, well, let me drop the pretense, okay, I'm trying to make the rationalist, Mr. E's story work. So let's see how this goes. And he says, doing that requires careful investigation of the differences between and relations among 4 different sorts of item. And here's the practical endorsement of the propriety of an inference from things being A to things being B. The explicit statement that one may infer the applicability of B from the applicability of A. The statement that A physically entails B, and the statement that all A's are necessarily B's. And he walks down the list, and it's an interesting dialectic, but one of the upshots of it is, he says, well, we can't really say that, though I think these things are metalinguistic in some sense, we can't say that they're metalinguistic in the clear sense that Carnap and Tarski have given to that term, where we would say, to say that all A's are necessarily B's is to say that the inference from you can apply A to it to you can apply B to it is a good one. And that's obviously wrong for 2 reasons. And one has to do with thinking about translations of this in other languages. So I might understand, he says, the statement in Turkish, the inference from you can apply A to you can apply B is a good one. And I would not understand that all A's are necessarily B's because I don't understand the terms. So just knowing metalinguistically that the inference from these terms was a good one wouldn't tell me that all A's are necessarily B's. So there's a problem from translation, and then there's a problem that it gets the counterfactuals wrong. So if there had never been language users, So there had never been the expressions A and B. It wouldn't be the case that the inference from the applicability of A to the applicability of B was a good one. But it still would be the case that all A's were necessarily B's. And that shows you that the statement, all A's are necessarily B's, is not about the linguistic items A and B. It's not about the words. It's about sort of what they mean. It can't be metalinguistic in the sense that what you're saying is something about these linguistic expressions. That gets the translation facts wrong, and it gets the counterfactuals wrong. So is there any way to recover the thought that this is nonetheless a metalinguistic statement? And as I say, I think, and so what he says is, the statement, all A's are necessarily B's, has the force of an endorsement of a rule of inference. And he says, and I want to point out that there's more than one way for a sentence to have the same force, to have a certain force. One way is that it can say that, and another is that it can convey that in some other way. And his example, not here, but he's used this convey talk as opposed to saying before. He says, when I say that it's a fine day, I say, it's a fine day. I've said that it's a fine day, but I've conveyed that I believe that it's a fine day. So he says that I have not said, I believe that it's a fine day. Again, what I've said could be true even if I didn't exist. So I haven't said that, but I have conveyed that. And so he says, so somehow we've got to use this broader notion of what's conveyed as opposed to what's said. And I take it that we can be more explicit than he is about that notion of conveying. I think when we are, it'll turn out that it doesn't help. But we can distinguish, that is, it won't do the work he wants it to do. We can distinguish between what's a semantic consequence and what's a pragmatic consequence. What follows from a speech act because of the content of it, and what follows because of the assertion of it from the speech act. So if John says, I can see that the tie is green, or just says the tie is green, he said that the tie is green, he's conveyed that he believes the tie is green. It follows from what he said that the tie is some color. It follows from his saying of it that he had some way of knowing that, presumably that he could see, or at least that he believed it. And we can tell the difference between the pragmatic inference, the one where the conclusion follows from him saying it, for instance, that he had an unobstructed line of sight to it, from what follows from the content of what he said by thinking of the conditional. So the conditional, if the tie is green, then the tie is some color, that's good. The conditional, if the tie is green, then John has an unobstructed view, or then John believes that the tie is green. No, there's no reason to endorse that conditional. The conditional is only showing you, endorsing the conditional is only endorsing what follows from the content, after all, in saying if the tie is green. Nobody's called the tie green. Nobody has performed that speech act. So I think that's the distinction that Sellars is invoking between what's said and what's conveyed, is between what follows from the content, and you would still endorse the conditionals, that's the test, Frege-Geach test for what's a part of the content, and the things that follow from the Speech Act, but which don't support the corresponding conditionals. But I want to say, though that was a good try, I don't think that distinction will do the work that Sellars wants. I think it's a gesture in the right direction, because I think, once again, what he has is an insight into what you're doing in making first-hand use of these modal expressions, endorsing a subjunctive conditional, is that you are inter alia laying down a rule of inference or endorsing a rule of inference. But to bring it back around to where I started this session, the relation between that and what you're saying is really complicated. And one way that we can see that there's got to be something right about the metalinguistic thought is that there certainly is some intimate relation between that rule for using the expressions A and B and the fact that all A's are necessarily B's. And that's showing that there's a relation between the use of the modal vocabulary, let's say the would, the vocabulary that's articulating the rulishness of the rule on the one hand, and the use of this other vocabulary, the ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary A and B, on the other hand. And there isn't, if A and B are like copper and melting, there isn't any vocabulary that stands to them the way the modal vocabulary stands to copper and to the terms copper and melting. So, is that clear? If it's right to say all A's are necessarily B's, that is endorsing a rule of inference about the use of this other vocabulary, A and B. Inter alia, at least, one is doing that. So there's a special relation between the necessarily or the would, on the one hand, what it's expressing, and these expressions that are just ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary. And there isn't anything that stands to the use of them the way the use of that modal vocabulary stands to the ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary. And that's a sort of unget-overable metalinguistic. The use of this other vocabulary is tied up with the use of the modal vocabulary in a way that has no analog for ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary. And what we want is some meta vocabulary for talking about that relation. That's what we're after. That's what Sellars couldn't sort out. In this case, in the case of Look's talk, we'll see in the case of his nominalism either. All right, I'm going to say one last thing. This passage at the very end, okay, it's from 103. I'm not sure where. So it's in the bottom of page 3. It's important to realize that the presence in the object language of the causal modalities serves not only to express existing commitments, but also to provide the framework for the thinking by which we reason our way into the making of new commitments and the abandoning of old. This is what he makes of inductive inference and so on. And since this framework essentially involves quantification over predicate variables, puzzles over the existence of abstract entities are almost as responsible for the prevalence in the empiricist tradition of nothing butism in its various forms, emotivism, philosophical behaviorism, and phenomenalism, as is its tendency to assimilate all discourse to describing. I think this is really significant for how he was thinking about his overall project at this time. He's saying, look, there's two great bads. There's descriptivism, and there's a view about abstract entities, where it seems like the things we want to say commit us to them, but if we have any empiricist bones in our bodies at all, we find those abstract entities ontologically suspect and particularly epistemologically suspect. How do we know about them? So, and he's saying it's the confluence of these two things that causes empiricists to say that these in fact non-descriptive forms of discourse are defective. This is the nothing butism. It's what ties together his critique of phenomenalism, his critique in epistemology and semantics, his critique of behaviorism, of reductive behaviorism in the philosophy of mind, his treatment of modality. He doesn't say that here, but nothing butism about modality is the topic of the entire essay, so it's evident here. So he's saying there are these big areas of philosophical concern where one set of concerns drives us to recognizably the same strategy, what he's calling nothing butism, kind of reductive or dismissive strategy. What we can reduce is okay, and what we can't, we've got to get rid of. And it's descriptivism, and it's a view about abstract entities. Well, what we're going to talk about starting 2 weeks from now is the 3 essays where he addresses not descriptivism, but the abstract entities. So I think he's epitomizing in here sort of what his program is, sort of in 1957, that he's then going to fill out. Okay.